At 1 a.m., my daughter-in-law sent me 15 messages trying to blackmail me. "Tomorrow you'll have nothing left." I replied, "Okay, dear." I took 3 steps into the living room and opened my hidden safe. The next day, she got a surprise. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." The phone buzzed against my nightstand at exactly 1 in the morning, then again and again. By the 15th message, I knew something had shifted in the delicate balance I'd been maintaining with my daughter-in-law for the past 8 years. I sat up in bed, my 63-year-old joints protesting the sudden movement, and reached for my reading glasses. The messages were all from Nola, my son Darren's wife, and each one made my stomach clench tighter than the last. "Nellie, I know about the will. I know what you're planning. You think you can cut me out? After everything I've done for this family, I've given you the best years of my life, and this is how you repay me?" The messages continued, each one more venomous than the last. Accusations flew across my phone screen like daggers. How I was selfish, how I was ungrateful for all her sacrifices, how I didn't deserve to see my grandchildren if I couldn't appreciate what she'd given up for our family. But it was the final message that made my blood run cold. "Tomorrow you won't have anything left. I'll make sure Darren understands exactly what kind of mother you really are. The kids will never know their grandmother existed." I set the phone down with trembling hands. 8 years. 8 years of walking on eggshells, of biting my tongue when Nola made subtle digs about my cooking, my housekeeping, my parenting. 8 years of watching my son slowly distance himself from me as Nola whispered poison in his ear during every family gathering. I thought about my granddaughter Emma, now 7, who used to run to me with scraped knees and broken toys. These days, she barely made eye contact during our supervised visits. And little Jake, my 5-year-old grandson, who Nola had convinced to call her parents the real grandparents because they bought him more expensive gifts. The tears came then, hot and bitter. I'd worked 2 jobs for 30 years after my husband died, saving every penny I could to make sure Darren had everything he needed. College tuition, a down payment for his first house, help with the wedding expenses when he married Nola. I'd given everything, asked for nothing in return except to be part of their lives. And now Nola wanted to take even that away. I wiped my eyes and looked at my phone again. The last message was still there, glowing in the darkness like a threat. "Tomorrow you won't have anything left?" A strange calm settled over me as I typed back my response. My fingers didn't shake anymore. My breathing steadied. "Okay, querida." I hit send and set the phone aside. Then I walked to my living room, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors Darren had helped me install 5 years ago, back when he still called me every Sunday and brought the kids over for dinner without being asked. In the corner of the room, behind my grandmother's antique armoire, I pressed a section of wall that looked identical to every other panel. It clicked softly, revealing a hidden safe I'd had installed 3 years ago when I first realized what Nola was truly capable of. Inside wasn't just money, though there was plenty of that. Neat stacks of documents filled most of the space. Bank statements showing accounts Nola didn't know existed. Property deeds for the small rental properties I'd quietly purchased over the years. Investment portfolios that had grown substantially since I'd started working with a financial advisor who understood the value of discretion. But more importantly, there were the recordings. Hours and hours of audio files stored on a small digital device. Conversations where Nola admitted to intercepting my calls to Darren, where she laughed about making excuses for why the children couldn't visit their grandmother, where she discussed her plans to gradually push me out of the family entirely once she figured out how to access what she assumed was my modest savings account. I pulled out a folder labeled Family Communications and flipped through photographs I'd taken of text messages, emails, and even handwritten notes where Nola had instructed Darren on how to handle his difficult mother. Screenshots of social media posts where she portrayed herself as the long-suffering daughter-in-law dealing with an increasingly demanding elderly woman. The evidence was damning, but I'd hoped I'd never need to use it. At the very back of the safe was a sealed envelope with my attorney's letterhead. Inside were documents that would change everything. papers I'd had drawn up 6 months ago when I realized Nola's manipulation was escalating beyond simple family tension. I'd known this day would come. Nola had been circling like a vulture ever since she'd overheard me talking to my financial advisor about updating my estate planning. She'd assumed, like everyone else, that my modest lifestyle meant modest savings. She had no idea that decades of careful investing and multiple income streams had built something substantial. More importantly, she had no idea that I'd been documenting her behavior for 3 years, ever since the day she'd prevented Emma from calling me when the little girl had fallen off her bike and asked for Grandma Nellie. I closed the safe and returned to my bedroom. The phone showed no new messages from Nola, but I knew tomorrow would bring the storm she'd been brewing for months. She would mobilize Darren, probably involve her own parents, and paint me as the villain who was keeping the family apart with my unreasonable demands and difficult personality. But I wasn't the same woman who had quietly absorbed her insults for 8 years. I wasn't the grieving widow who had been so grateful to see her son happy that she'd overlooked the warning signs. I wasn't the grandmother who would sacrifice her dignity for stolen moments with children who were being taught to see her as a burden. Tomorrow, Nola would discover that threatening someone means nothing when they have nothing left to lose, and everything to gain. The morning after Nola's threats, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the folder of evidence I'd been collecting for 3 years. Each document told a story of calculated manipulation that would have impressed a psychology textbook. It started small, the way these things always do. The first recording was from 18 months after Darren and Nola's wedding. I'd been invited to Sunday dinner, and while helping in the kitchen, I'd overheard Nola on the phone with her sister. She just hovers, you know. Like, I get that she's lonely since her husband died, but I didn't sign up to be Darren's mother's entertainment committee. I swear she finds excuses to call every other day. I'd been calling twice a week to check on them, something I'd done with Darren since he moved out at 18. But listening to Nola's irritated tone, I realized my concern was being reframed as neediness. The second recording came 6 months later. This time, I'd arrived early to babysit Emma while they went to dinner. Nola was upstairs, talking to someone on her cell phone, her voice carrying through the thin walls of their starter home. I told Darren we need to set boundaries. His mother acts like she has some kind of right to our children. Yesterday she brought Emma a book without asking me first. I mean, what if I didn't approve of the content? She's not the parent here. The book had been Charlotte's Web, the same story I'd read to Darren when he was Emma's age. I'd found my old copy in the attic and thought she might enjoy it. Instead, it had become evidence of my overstepping. But it was the third recording that made me realize I needed to start documenting everything systematically. I'd been at their house for Emma's 4th birthday party. The guest list included Nola's parents, her sister's family, and several of their friends. I was the only representative from Darren's side of the family, though my late husband's sister lived just 2 hours away and had asked multiple times about visiting. While the adults chatted in the living room, I'd gone to use the bathroom upstairs. As I passed the master bedroom, I heard Nola talking to her mother through the cracked door. I don't know how much longer I can pretend to like her. She's so awkward at parties, and she always brings those homemade gifts that look cheap next to what normal people give. Emma's getting old enough to notice the difference. "Well, honey," her mother replied, "maybe it's time to start limiting contact. Children need consistency, and if she's making you uncomfortable in your own home." Exactly. And Darren's so loyal to her, but I think I can help him see that we need to prioritize our immediate family. The kids need stability, not some needy grandmother who doesn't understand modern parenting. That night, I went home and bought the digital recording device. I told myself it was just temporary, just until I could figure out how to address the situation directly with Darren. But as the months passed, the evidence mounted, and each conversation revealed new layers of Nola's strategy. She was masterful at rewriting history. When I brought up plans we'd made weeks in advance, she'd claim I'd misunderstood. When I offered to help with childcare, she'd mention how tired I looked, how maybe I should focus on taking care of myself. When the children asked about visiting Grandma Nellie's house, she'd redirect them to activities with her parents, who lived in a larger home with a swimming pool and expensive toys. The most damaging recording came last Christmas. I'd offered to host dinner, something I'd done every year since Darren was a teenager. But Nola suggested we alternate years, and this was her parents' turn. I'd agreed, hoping to keep the peace, and showed up with my traditional homemade pies and carefully wrapped presents. What I didn't know was that I'd arrived during a family conference call with Nola's extended relatives. My phone, sitting in my purse near the speakerphone, captured everything. "Darren's mother is here," Nola announced to the voice on the other end. "She brought those pies again. I swear she thinks we can't afford bakery desserts." "Oh, the controlling one you've mentioned?" replied what sounded like Nola's aunt. "The one who's always giving parenting advice? That's her. She keeps talking about how things were different when Darren was little, like I should follow her ancient methods. Yesterday, she suggested Emma might be getting too much screen time. Can you believe that?" I'd never given parenting advice. The screen time comment had been a casual observation about how quickly children adapted to technology, meant as a compliment to Emma's intelligence. "You need to nip that in the bud," the aunt continued. "My friend dealt with an overbearing mother-in-law for years. It nearly destroyed her marriage. These older women don't understand boundaries." "I know. I'm working on it." Darren's starting to see how her constant presence affects our family dynamic. "I think by next year, we'll have a much healthier distance." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Nola painting me as an intrusive, outdated burden who couldn't accept that her son had moved on. She shared twisted versions of innocent interactions, turning my attempts to be helpful into examples of manipulation. But the most chilling part came when her father joined the call. "Maybe you should start documenting these incidents," he suggested. "If she ever tries to claim she has rights to see the grandchildren, you'll need evidence of her inappropriate behavior." "Already ahead of you, Dad. I've been keeping a record of every time she oversteps, just in case." That's when I realized Nola wasn't just trying to distance me from the family. She was building a case against me, preparing for the day when she could justify cutting me off entirely. The irony wasn't lost on me. While she was documenting my supposed transgressions, I was recording her actual manipulation. While she was painting me as the villain in her story, I was collecting evidence of her calculated emotional abuse. Over the next 2 years, the pattern became clear. Every invitation came with conditions. Every interaction was scrutinized and reframed. Every attempt I made to maintain a relationship with my son and grandchildren was twisted into evidence of my selfishness. But I endured it all, keeping meticulous records, because I believed that eventually, Darren would see through her manipulation. I thought that if I just stayed patient, stayed kind, stayed available, the truth would reveal itself. Last night's messages proved how naive I'd been. Nola wasn't planning to gradually distance me from the family. She was preparing to eliminate me entirely, and she was confident enough in her manipulation to issue ultimatums. She had no idea that while she'd been playing games, I'd been building a case that would expose not just her lies, but the systematic way she'd poisoned my relationship with my son. The phone rang, interrupting my memories. Darren's name appeared on the screen, and I knew the real battle was about to begin. The phone call from Darren came at exactly 9 in the morning, just as I was finishing my second cup of coffee. His voice was strained, careful, like he was reading from a script. "Mom, we need to talk. Can you come over this afternoon?" I could hear Nola in the background, her voice a low murmur that I couldn't quite make out, but the tone was unmistakably coaching. This wasn't my son calling for a casual chat. This was the opening move in Nola's carefully orchestrated campaign. "Of course, sweetheart. Is everything all right?" There was a pause, and I could almost see him looking to Nola for guidance. "We just think it's time we had an honest conversation about family expectations, about boundaries." Boundaries. That was Nola's favorite word, right after toxic and manipulation. Over the years, I'd heard her use these terms to describe anyone who didn't fall in line with her vision of how relationships should work. "I'll be there at 2, I told him, keeping my voice light and agreeable. "Should I bring anything?" "No, Mom. Just come ready to listen, okay?" After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a strange sense of relief. The waiting was over. The careful dance of pretending everything was normal could finally end. I spent the morning organizing the evidence I'd collected, selecting the most damning recordings and documents, not to attack, but to defend myself when the inevitable accusations came. I knew Nola well enough by now to predict exactly how this conversation would unfold. At exactly 2 o'clock, I knocked on the door of the house I'd helped them buy. Nola answered, her smile bright and artificial, the same expression she wore when posting family photos on social media. "Nellie, come in, come in. Can I get you some tea?" The formality was new. For 8 years, she'd called me Mom, at least when Darren was around. The shift to my first name was deliberate, a subtle way of establishing that I was no longer considered family. Darren sat at their dining room table, papers spread in front of him. I recognized some of them. Financial documents related to my estate planning that I'd shared with him months ago, back when I still believed in transparency and trust. "Sit down, Mom," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Nola and I have been talking, and we think there are some things we need to clear up." I sat across from them, noting how they'd positioned themselves on the same side of the table, a united front against the common enemy. Nola reached over and squeezed Darren's hand, a gesture of support that looked loving but felt calculated. "We want you to know that we appreciate everything you've done for our family," Nola began, her voice sickeningly sweet. "But we're concerned that some of your recent behavior has been putting strain on our relationship." Recent behavior. I almost laughed. The most recent thing I'd done was bring Emma a book about dinosaurs because she'd mentioned liking them during our last supervised visit 3 weeks ago. "I'm not sure I understand," I said carefully. Darren shifted uncomfortably and pulled out a piece of paper. It was a list, typed and formatted like a legal document. "We've been documenting some incidents that we think show a pattern of boundary crossing." I listened as he read from Nola's carefully constructed narrative. According to their version of events, I was guilty of showing up unannounced. This referred to the time I'd stopped by to return a casserole dish and stayed for 10 minutes. I was accused of questioning their parenting decisions. Apparently, my comment about Emma being so smart had been interpreted as criticism of their educational choices. I was charged with trying to manipulate the children against their parents. This stemmed from telling Jake a story about his father as a little boy. Each accusation was a masterful distortion of innocent interactions, twisted to paint me as an intrusive, boundary-crossing grandmother who couldn't accept her reduced role in the family. "Furthermore," Nola continued, taking over when Darren seemed to struggle with the more venomous accusations, "we've noticed that you seem to be using money to try to maintain control over our family. The constant gifts, the offers to pay for things we haven't asked for, the way you bring up your financial contributions to our life together." This was rich, coming from someone who had specifically asked me to help with their mortgage when Darren's hours were cut 2 years ago. I'd never mentioned that contribution since, but apparently, my existence was reminder enough of their dependence. "We think," Darren said, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to the script, "that you need to step back and let us be our own family. The kids are getting confused about who's in charge, and Nola feels like she can't be comfortable in her own home when she's constantly being judged." I looked at my daughter-in-law, this woman I'd welcomed into our family with open arms, who had slowly but systematically destroyed my relationship with my son. She met my gaze with manufactured sadness, playing the role of the wounded victim perfectly. "I love you, Nellie," she said, and I marveled at how sincere she could sound while delivering a knife to my heart. "But I need to protect my children and my marriage. We think it would be best if we took a break from regular contact, maybe holiday cards, occasional phone calls, but no more weekly visits or spontaneous drop-ins." The room was silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, another gift I'd given them for their 5th anniversary. I could see Emma's backpack by the front door, probably full of the school supplies I'd bought her last month when she mentioned needing new folders. "And if I don't agree to these new terms?" I asked quietly. Nola and Darren exchanged a look, and I saw the steel beneath her concerned expression. "Then we'll have to consider more permanent boundaries," she said, "for the sake of our family's mental health." "More permanent boundaries. She meant cutting me off entirely, exactly as she'd threatened in her midnight messages. This whole conversation was just a formality, a way to make Darren feel like they'd tried to work things out before taking drastic action. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised single-handedly after his father died, who had once called me his hero and his best friend. He was staring at his hands, unable to meet my eyes, but nodding along with his wife's ultimatum. "I understand," I said finally, and I saw relief flood Nola's face. She thought I was capitulating, accepting exile from my own family. "We knew you'd understand," she said, reaching across the table to pat my hand in a gesture that felt like dismissal. "This is really for the best. You'll see." "Yes," I agreed, standing up slowly. "I think I will see. In fact, I think we should make this official. Would tomorrow morning work for you? Say 10 o'clock at my attorney's office?" The color drained from Nola's face. "Your attorney?" "Well, if we're establishing new boundaries and discussing family relationships, I think it's important to have everything properly documented, don't you?" Darren looked confused, but Nola's eyes had sharpened with suspicion. "What kind of documentation?" I smiled, the same bright, artificial smile she'd been giving me for years. "Oh, just making sure everyone understands exactly where they stand. I'll have my lawyer send you the address." As I walked to the door, I could hear them whispering urgently behind me. Nola's voice was rising, and I caught fragments of worried questions. "What does she mean? What kind of lawyer? Do you think she's going to try to sue us?" I let myself out without another word, leaving them to stew in their uncertainty. For 3 years, I had endured their manipulation, documented their abuse, and planned for this moment. Tomorrow, they would discover that underestimating a quiet woman was the biggest mistake they could have made. The drive home felt different somehow, lighter. I wasn't the same broken grandmother who had absorbed their cruelty for years. I was a woman with a plan, evidence, and absolutely nothing left to lose. The law office of Peterson, Mitchell and Associates occupied the entire 3rd floor of downtown's most prestigious building. I'd chosen this firm specifically because I knew it would intimidate Nola, who measured worth by appearances and assumed that expensive meant powerful. I arrived 15 minutes early and spent the time reviewing my documentation with my attorney, Margaret Peterson. She was a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in family law and had seen enough manipulation to recognize it immediately when I'd first approached her 6 months ago. "Are you certain you want to proceed this way?" Margaret asked, arranging the evidence folders on the conference table. "Once we reveal what you've documented, there's no going back to the way things were." "The way things were was slowly killing me," I replied. "And my relationship with my son was already destroyed. At least this way, he'll know the truth." At exactly 10 o'clock, Darren and Nola arrived. I could see them through the glass walls of the conference room, Nola tugging at her outfit nervously while Darren checked his watch repeatedly. They'd both dressed up, Nola in a black suit that was probably meant to convey seriousness, Darren in the only tie I'd ever seen him wear outside of funerals. Margaret escorted them in, her professional demeanor betraying nothing of the bomb we were about to detonate. "Please have a seat," she said, gesturing to the chairs across from where I sat. "Mrs. Holloway has asked me to facilitate this family meeting to ensure everyone understands the legal implications of the boundaries being discussed." Nola's eyes darted around the room, taking in the law degrees on the walls, the thick legal books, the formal setting that was so different from their dining room ambush yesterday. This wasn't her territory, and she knew it. "Legal implications?" Darren asked, confusion clear in his voice. "Mom, what's this about?" Margaret opened the first folder and withdrew a neat stack of papers. "Your mother has been documenting concerning patterns of behavior for the past 3 years. Before we discuss any changes to family relationships, she felt it was important to address these issues formally. Documenting what patterns?" Nola's voice was sharp, defensive. "What are you talking about?" I watched my daughter-in-law's face as Margaret began reading from the transcripts. The color drained from her cheeks as she heard her own words quoted back to her. The conversations where she'd called me controlling, needy, and inappropriate. The phone calls where she'd discussed strategies for limiting my access to the grandchildren. The family meetings where she'd painted me as the villain in their perfect life story. These recordings were made in public spaces and during family gatherings, Margaret explained in response to Nola's sputtered protests about privacy. Mrs. Holloway was legally entitled to document conversations she was present for or that occurred in her vicinity. Darren sat in stunned silence as recording after recording was presented. His face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally, dawning comprehension. This was his wife's voice describing his mother as a burden to be managed. These were his wife's strategies for systematically removing me from their lives. "Nola," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is this true? Did you really say these things?" She turned to him with tears in her eyes, and for a moment, I thought she might actually admit the truth. Instead, she doubled down on her victim narrative. "Darling, you have to understand. I was venting to my family because I was stressed. Your mother was putting so much pressure on me and I didn't know how to handle it. Everyone needs to vent sometimes." "Venting is one thing," Margaret interjected smoothly. "Systematic campaigns of alienation are another. Let me share some additional documentation." The next folder contained screenshots of text messages and emails. Messages where Nola had instructed Darren on what to tell me when I called. Emails where she'd coordinated with her parents to ensure their family events conflicted with mine. Text conversations where she'd coached him on how to make me feel unwelcome without being obviously cruel. But it was the financial documentation that made Darren's hands shake. "Your mother has also documented the financial support she's provided to your family over the past 8 years, Margaret continued. Mortgage assistance totaling $28,000, childcare expenses of approximately $15,000, educational supplies, clothing, and gifts for the children amounting to another $12,000. This doesn't include the down payment assistance for your home purchase or the wedding expenses she covered." I watched Nola's face as the numbers were read aloud. She'd convinced Darren that my contributions were minimal, that I was exaggerating my sacrifices to maintain control. The detailed records painted a very different picture. "Mom," Darren said, looking at me with something approaching horror. "I had no idea it was that much. Nola said you'd only helped with a few thousand here and there." "There's more," Margaret said, opening the final folder. "Yesterday's meeting wasn't the first time Mrs. Nola has attempted to manipulate family finances. We have documentation of her researching your mother's assets, contacting her bank with false claims of being a concerned family member, and discussing plans to contest any will that doesn't include substantial provisions for her personally." The room went dead silent. Nola's tears had stopped, replaced by a cold calculation as she realized how thoroughly she'd been caught. "You recorded me," she said, her voice flat with accusation. "You've been spying on your own family." "I documented a pattern of emotional abuse and financial manipulation," I replied calmly. "Which brings us to why we're here today." Margaret withdrew a thick legal document from her briefcase. "Mrs. Holloway is prepared to offer the following resolution. All financial support will cease immediately. However, she will not pursue legal action for the documented harassment and manipulation, provided certain conditions are met." Nola leaned forward, her lawyer instincts finally kicking in. "What conditions?" "First, all lies and distortions about Mrs. Holloway's character must be publicly corrected. Any family members who have been told false stories about her behavior must be informed of the truth." "That's humiliating," Nola protested. "Not as humiliating as having these recordings played for the entire extended family," Margaret replied smoothly. "Second, visitation with the grandchildren will be restored to the schedule that existed before the systematic alienation began." "And if we don't agree?" Darren asked, though he was looking at his wife rather than me. "Then Mrs. Holloway will pursue all legal remedies available to her, including restraining orders for harassment, demands for repayment of financial support obtained under false pretenses, and documentation of parental alienation that could affect future custody considerations should your marriage encounter difficulties." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Nola understood immediately that her carefully constructed world was crumbling. Not only was her manipulation exposed, but her future security was in jeopardy. "This is blackmail," she said finally. "No," I said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. "Blackmail is what you did to me last night. This is consequences." Darren was staring at the table, processing everything he'd heard. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with shame and something that looked like grief. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I believed." "You believed the woman you loved," I said gently. "That's not something to apologize for. But now you know the truth." The silence stretched until Margaret cleared her throat. "I'll need an answer by Friday. Mrs. Holloway has been patient for 3 years, but her patience has limits." As we prepared to leave, Nola made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "You'll regret this, Nellie. You'll lose your son forever." I turned to look at her, this woman who had systematically destroyed my family while playing the victim. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't afraid of her threats. "I lost my son the day he married you," I said quietly, "but maybe now I can find him again." The call came Thursday evening, just 24 hours before Margaret's deadline. Darren's number appeared on my phone, and I hesitated before answering. After what had been revealed in that conference room, I wasn't sure what to expect from my son. "Mom." His voice was rough, like he'd been crying. "Can I come over? Alone?" "Of course, sweetheart." When he arrived 30 minutes later, he looked like he'd aged years in the 3 days since our meeting with Margaret. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that reminded me of the sleepless nights he'd endured as a colicky baby. He sat on my couch, the same spot where he used to curl up with me for bedtime stories, and buried his face in his hands. "I've been going through everything," he said without looking up. "All the times you tried to call and I was too busy. All the events you weren't invited to because Nola said you wouldn't enjoy them. All the stories she told me about things you supposedly said or did." I waited, letting him work through the revelation at his own pace. "She played me, Mom. For 8 years she played me like a violin, and I was too stupid to see it." "You weren't stupid," I said gently. "You were in love with someone who was very good at manipulation." He finally looked up, and I saw my little boy in his tear-filled eyes. "Remember when Emma was 3, and you brought her that dollhouse you'd made? Nola told me you'd said Emma's toys weren't good enough, that you were trying to show us up with expensive gifts." I remembered. I'd spent weeks crafting that dollhouse from scratch, painting tiny furniture and sewing miniature curtains because Emma had mentioned wanting one like the picture in her favorite book. "I never said anything like that." "I know that now. God, Mom, I know that now." He pulled out his phone and showed me a text message. "Look what I found when I went through her old messages." The text was from Nola to her sister, dated the day after I'd given Emma the dollhouse. "Darren's mom brought Emma this elaborate homemade dollhouse today. It's actually pretty amazing, but I told Darren she was being condescending about our store-bought toys. I need him to start seeing her as the problem, not the solution." My heart broke reading those words, not just for myself, but for my son, who was discovering that his reality had been carefully constructed by someone he trusted. "There are dozens of these," he continued, scrolling through his phone. "Messages where she planned exactly what to tell me after every interaction with you. She even practiced conversations with her mother about how to make me feel like you were the one causing problems." He stood up abruptly and walked to my window, staring out at the garden where he used to play as a child. "The worst part is, I defended her. When my co-workers asked why you never came to company picnics anymore, I told them you preferred to keep to yourself. When Aunt Linda asked why she hadn't seen you at family events, I said you'd been having health issues and couldn't handle crowds. You were protecting your wife. That's what good husbands do." "No, Mom. Good husbands don't let their wives systematically destroy their mother's reputation while hiding behind love and loyalty." He turned back to face me, anger finally breaking through the grief. "Do you know what she did Tuesday night, after we got home from the lawyer's office?" I shook my head. She tried to convince me that you'd somehow manipulated the recordings, that you'd edited them or taken things out of context. When I pointed out that there were hours of continuous audio, she said you'd probably been recording private conversations for years, violating our privacy. The irony was staggering. After years of documenting my supposed transgressions, Nola was now outraged that I'd documented her actual manipulation. What did you tell her? I told her I needed time to think. And I've been thinking, Mom. I've been thinking about everything. He came back to the couch, sitting closer this time. I remembered things I'd forgotten, like how you used to call every Sunday until suddenly you stopped. Nola said you'd gotten too busy with your own life. But now I realize she probably intercepted those calls. She did. I have recordings of her telling people she was screening your calls to protect your family time. Darren's jaw clenched. And the kids. Jesus, Mom. What she did to the kids. This was the part I'd been dreading. The systematic alienation hadn't just targeted me, it had shaped how my grandchildren saw their family structure. Emma asked me yesterday why Grandma Nellie never comes to her school events like Nola's parents do. I told her you were always invited, and she looked at me like I was lying. She said Mommy told her that some grandparents are too busy with their own lives to care about children. The pain in his voice was raw, and I felt tears burning behind my eyes. This was what Nola's manipulation had cost us, not just my relationship with Darren, but his children's understanding of love and family. There's more, he continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. I found her diary. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear this, but I could see he needed to tell me. She's been planning this for 2 years, Mom. Not just pushing you out, but positioning herself to inherit everything when you die. She researched elder abuse laws, looking for ways to prove you were mentally incompetent. She contacted Adult Protective Services with false reports about your living conditions. My blood went cold. She what? They came to investigate, remember? Last year, when that social worker showed up asking about your safety and well-being? You thought it was a routine check, but Nola had called in an anonymous tip claiming you were showing signs of dementia and living in unsafe conditions. I remembered that visit. The kind social worker who'd seemed confused about why she was there, since I was obviously healthy and my home was well maintained. She'd left after 20 minutes, but not before asking several pointed questions about my mental state and whether I had adequate support systems. The worker's report is probably still on file somewhere, Darren continued. Nola was building a case for having you declared incompetent so she could control your assets. She wrote about it like it was a business plan. The calculated cruelty was breathtaking. While I'd been grieving the loss of my family, Nola had been systematically laying groundwork to steal my autonomy and my assets. I also found something else in her diary, Darren said, his voice now barely audible. About the house. What about the house? You know how we've been living in that house for 5 years? How we got such a good deal on it because the owner needed to sell quickly. He looked at me with anguish in his eyes. Mom, you bought that house. You've been the owner this entire time. The room seemed to tilt. What are you talking about? The mortgage payments we thought we were making to the bank? They've been going into an account you set up. You bought the house outright and created a fake mortgage system so we could afford the payments and feel independent. Nola figured it out 6 months ago when she tried to refinance. I stared at my son, remembering the day he'd called me. So excited about finding their dream home, but devastated that they couldn't qualify for the loan. I'd worked behind the scenes with my financial advisor to structure a purchase that would give them the dignity of making payments while ensuring they had a stable home for my grandchildren. She's known for 6 months that you own our house, and she's been planning how to get legal ownership transferred to her name. She was going to use the elder abuse claims to prove you'd been manipulating us financially, making us dependent so you could control our lives. The pieces clicked into place, the sudden escalation in Nola's hostility, the ultimatums about family boundaries, the midnight threats about me losing everything. She hadn't just discovered my will, she discovered that I owned their home, and she wanted it. Darren, I said slowly, there's something else you need to know. I went to my safe and retrieved the property deeds. When I returned, I spread them across the coffee table where he could see them clearly. I don't just own your house. I own the rental property where Nola's sister lives. I own the small apartment building where her parents have their unit. I own the commercial space where her father's business operates. Darren's face went white as he processed the implications. For the past 3 years, while Nola has been working to destroy my relationship with this family, she's been living in my properties. Her family has been benefiting from my investments, and her father's business has been operating in my building. I never told any of them because I didn't want money to complicate our relationships. Oh, God, Darren whispered. She's going to lose everything. Not if she agrees to Margaret's terms. I have no interest in making her family homeless. But I won't continue to subsidize people who are actively working to destroy me. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 8 years of manipulation finally exposed. My son sat surrounded by the evidence of his wife's betrayal, and I could see him struggling to reconcile the woman he'd married with the calculating predator the evidence revealed. "What happens now?" he asked finally. "That depends on what Nola decides to do. But Darren, whatever happens between you and her, I want you to know that my door is always open for you and the children. Always." He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I've wasted so many years, Mom. So many moments with you and the kids that I can never get back." "We can't change the past," I said, reaching over to take his hand. "But we can decide what happens next." Friday morning came, and with it, Margaret's deadline. But I already knew what Nola's answer would be. A woman who had spent years orchestrating elaborate deceptions wasn't going to suddenly choose honesty and accountability. The real question was whether my son would finally be ready to see his marriage for what it truly was. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching the somber mood that had settled over our family since the revelations began. I sat in Margaret's office, watching the clock tick toward the 10 o'clock deadline we'd given Nola to respond to our terms. At 9:58, Darren arrived alone. His appearance told the story before he said a word. His wedding ring was missing. There were fresh scratches on his arms, and he carried a single suitcase that suggested he'd left in a hurry. "She's not coming," he said, slumping into the chair beside me. "And she's not agreeing to your terms." Margaret leaned forward with professional interest. "Did she provide a response?" Darren laughed bitterly. "Oh, she provided a response, all right. She threw a lamp at my head and told me that if I chose my psychotic mother over my wife, I'd never see my children again. Where are Emma and Jake now?" I asked, my heart clenching with worry for my grandchildren. "With her parents. She packed them up Wednesday night and drove them there, telling them I was having a mental health crisis and needed time to get better." His voice cracked. "She's poisoning them against me now, the same way she poisoned me against you." Margaret made notes on her legal pad. "Has she filed any legal motions regarding custody?" "Not yet, but she's threatened to. She says she has years of documentation proving I'm an unfit father because I've been unstable about family relationships. Apparently, every time I defended you over the years counts as evidence of my poor judgment." The twisted logic was quintessentially Nola. She'd manipulated Darren into doubting his own perceptions for years, and now his moments of clarity were being reframed as mental illness. "There's something else," Darren continued, pulling out his phone. "She posted this on social media yesterday." He showed us a Facebook post that made my stomach churn. It was a long, emotional essay about how Nola was protecting her children from a toxic grandmother who had been financially manipulating the family for years. She'd painted herself as the brave mother, standing up to an abusive elder who used money to control people's lives. The post had dozens of supportive comments from people who didn't know the real story. Friends and distant relatives expressing outrage on Nola's behalf, praising her courage for setting boundaries with a narcissistic mother-in-law. "She's already started her campaign," Margaret observed. "She's positioning herself as the victim before you have a chance to tell your side of the story." I read through the post again, marveling at how skillfully Nola had woven truth and lies together. Yes, I had provided financial support to their family. Yes, I had been documenting concerning behavior, but the context and motivations were so distorted that the facts became weapons against me. "What are our options?" I asked. "Legally, we have several paths," Margaret replied. We can pursue the harassment charges based on the documented threats. We can demand repayment of the financial support provided under false pretenses. We can expose the property ownership situation, which would immediately displace her family from their homes. All of those options felt like Pyrrhic victories. Yes, I could destroy Nola financially and socially, but at what cost to my grandchildren? They were innocent victims in this situation, and they'd already lost too much. There's another option, Darren said quietly. I could fight for custody myself. Margaret and I both looked at him with surprise. I've been thinking about this all night, he continued. Nola's pattern of manipulation didn't just target you, Mom. She's been controlling and isolating me for years, too. I have documentation now of her systematic lies, her financial schemes, her attempts to alienate the children from their grandmother. Custody battles are ugly, Darren, Margaret warned, especially when one parent has been building a case for years. She'll claim you're choosing your mother over your children's well-being. Maybe. But I'd rather fight for my kids than abandon them to be raised by someone who thinks manipulation and lies are acceptable parenting tools. I felt a surge of pride for my son. After years of being manipulated and controlled, he was finally ready to fight for what mattered. What would you need from me? I asked. Everything. The recordings, the financial documentation, the property records. I want the court to see exactly who Nola really is and what she's been doing to our family. Over the next several hours, we developed a strategy. Darren would file for divorce and joint custody, using the evidence I'd collected to demonstrate Nola's pattern of manipulation and deception. I would provide character testimony and financial documentation to support his case, but the real battle wasn't going to be fought in court. It was going to be fought in the hearts and minds of two confused children who had been taught that love came with conditions and that family loyalty could be bought and sold. The custody proceedings took 6 months. During that time, I saw my grandchildren exactly twice, both times during court-supervised visits where they sat stiffly beside their mother, clearly coached on what to say and how to behave. Emma, now 8, had developed a nervous habit of looking to Nola for approval before speaking. Jake, at 6, seemed confused about why Daddy lived in a different house and why they couldn't visit Grandma Nellie anymore. But children are more perceptive than adults often realize. During our second supervised visit, Emma asked me quietly, "Grandma, did you really try to steal our house?" "No, sweetheart," I replied carefully, aware that every word was being monitored. "I helped your parents buy your house because I wanted you to have a safe place to live." "But Mommy says you were trying to control us with money." "Sometimes adults disagree about things, Emma. What matters is that you and Jake are loved by many people, and that will never change." Jake, who had been playing with a toy car, looked up suddenly. "I remember when you used to make pancakes shaped like dinosaurs," he said. "Can you make those again sometime?" The supervised visit monitor made a note in her file, but I saw something in Jake's eyes that gave me hope. He remembered. Despite all of Nola's attempts to rewrite history, he remembered the love. The custody hearing itself was a revelation. When Margaret presented the evidence I'd collected, even the judge seemed stunned by the scope of Nola's manipulation. The recordings were particularly damaging, as they showed her admitting to deliberate campaigns of alienation and her plans to financially exploit my family. But it was Darren's testimony that sealed the case. He spoke quietly and honestly about how he'd been manipulated, how his perceptions had been shaped by someone he trusted, and how he'd failed to protect his children from the same manipulation. "I thought I was being a good husband by supporting my wife," he told the court. "I didn't realize I was enabling someone who was systematically destroying my family relationships and teaching my children that love was conditional on obedience." The judge awarded Darren primary custody, with Nola receiving supervised visitation until she completed counseling and demonstrated she could maintain relationships without manipulation or control. The property situation was resolved more quietly. I transferred ownership of Nola's family properties to them at fair market value, financed through reasonable payment plans. I had no interest in making them homeless, but I also wouldn't continue subsidizing people who had actively worked to destroy me. Nola's social media campaign backfired spectacularly when the court documents became public record. The same relatives who had supported her suddenly found themselves questioning what they thought they knew about the situation. But the real victory came 6 months after the custody decision, when Emma knocked on my door carrying a plate of homemade cookies. "Dad said we could walk over and visit if we wanted to," she said shyly. "Jake wanted to ask about those dinosaur pancakes. I invited them in, and we spent the afternoon in my kitchen, making pancakes shaped like all sorts of creatures, while they told me about school and friends and the things that matter to children when adults stop using them as weapons." Darren arrived at dinner time, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. "How did the visit go?" he asked, though the flour on the children's clothes and their excited chatter probably answered his question. "We learned that Grandma Nellie knows how to make pancakes that look like unicorns," Jake announced proudly. "And she has a secret recipe for chocolate chip cookies," Emma added, carefully carrying her plate of treats. As we sat around my kitchen table, sharing a simple dinner and listening to the children's stories, I realized that this was what I'd been fighting for all along. Not winning or being right, but having my family back. The cost had been high. Years of pain, the destruction of relationships, and the revelation of ugly truths that could never be unknown. But sitting there with my son and grandchildren, seeing them free from the weight of manipulation and lies, I knew it had been worth every difficult moment. Nola moved across the country 6 months later, starting fresh somewhere no one knew her story. She sends birthday cards to the children occasionally, but makes no effort to rebuild the relationships she destroyed. Perhaps that's for the best. Some battles aren't about winning. They're about refusing to lose yourself to someone else's cruelty. And sometimes, the only way to save your family is to be willing to lose it first. Emma finished her cookies and looked up at me with chocolate on her chin. "Grandma, will you teach me how to make that dollhouse like the one you gave me when I was little?" "I still have that dollhouse," I told her. "It's upstairs in my craft room, waiting for you to play with it again." As she ran upstairs to find it, Jake following close behind, Darren reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Thank you, Mom," he said, "for fighting for us when we were too blind to fight for ourselves." I squeezed back, listening to the sound of my grandchildren's laughter echoing through the house. That's what family does, sweetheart. Real family. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.